Get a number of these pages. That could be a problem. Anyway, so today I hope to give some information that will help answer the question, how should I keep the Sabbath? And so what I'm going to do is look at a few of the examples that were prohibited in the Bible, and think about the amount of work it would take for those people at that time to do those particular things. And then in my mind, you can look at that amount of effort and kind of compare it to things today. And that's kind of how I make those decisions for myself. Now, I'm not going to tell you how to make your own decisions, just some of the background information that you might want to use for that. So as Christians, we all here try to live our life by the Bible. However, of all the thousands of things you can do, the Bible only specifically mentions a very small set. So we, all of us, I'm sure, make up our own set of rules that we live by, that kind of, they're specific to each thing we run across. And, because there's thousands of things that come up each day. And so we have to decide for ourselves how to apply the principles. And so I call this like a list of personal rules. And in Romans 14, it actually talks about that a little bit. So it goes, starting in verse 20, breaking into it, it says, "It is wrong for a person to eat anything that causes someone else to stumble. It is better not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything else that will cause your brother or sister to fall. So whatever you believe about these things, keep to yourself, between yourself and God. Blessed is he who does not condemn himself by what he approves. But whoever has doubts is condemned if they eat, because their eating is not from faith, and everything else that does not come from faith is sin." So we see from these verses, it's important not to go against our conscience. And so here's an example of some people that felt it was wrong to eat meat, or maybe it was talking about meat to idols. I'm not sure exactly, but something that God would have said was okay, but they had made their own personal rule. So God actually honors some of that. However, I would say we need, so there's a limit though. Our personal rules have to match up with the Bible. We can't allow things the Bible doesn't. In my opinion, we really shouldn't restrict things that the Bible does allow. I mean, you're kind of putting unnecessary restrictions on yourself. But if you do, God will, kind of honor that, it looks like, in a lot of cases. And it talks about this a little bit too in Colossians 2:20. It goes, "Therefore, if you died with Christ from the basic principles of the world, why, as though living in the world, do you subject yourselves to regulations? Do not touch, do not taste, do not handle, which all concern things which perish with the using, according to the doctrines and commandments of men. These things indeed have the appearance of wisdom in self-imposed religion, false humility, neglect of the body, but are of no value against the indulgence of flesh." In other words, they're not really helping your walk with God. There's been plenty of, guys that would sit on poles back in, in ancient times and go for, days and weeks without eating and show how righteous they were. Well, these are the kind of restrictions some of the things he's talking about. And of course, again, I'm not going to, interfere with your list of rules. I'm just reading what the Bible has here. So now in this, Paul is talking about rules imposed by others. But I think the same principle would apply to rules we impose on ourselves. So the question of how we observe the Sabbath is no different. We have our own ideas how to properly keep it, pretty much with everything in our life, I think. So, but to limit the scope of this message, I'm going to concentrate on cooking and meal preparation, because it does have a few things to say about that. So preparing meals is actually one of the activities mentioned in the Bible that was banned for the Israelites. And so now it doesn't come out and say that. So I'll give you the verses that come up with that for the logic for that. So in Exodus 12:16, and this is the New International Version, speaking about the first day of unleavened bread, which, as we know, is a holy day. And it goes, on the first day, hold a sacred assembly and do no work at all on these days, except to prepare food for everyone to eat, that you may do. So it mentions that preparing food is work, because it said no work except. And then later in Leviticus 23, speaking of that same day, it uses the phrase, you shall do no customary work. So it depends on your translation. Other translations says laborious work, some say servile work, ordinary work, and regular work. But that phrase is used for every holy day except atonement. Now, atonement is an obvious exception because you shouldn't be doing meal preparation on a fast day anyway. So it's a lot easier to not do meal preparation on atonement. But in Leviticus 20, for atonement, it says, you shall do no manner of work. And without the except or saying customary, it's just no manner of work. But in Leviticus, so getting back to how this comes to the Sabbath, weekly Sabbath, in Leviticus 23:3, it says, speaking of the weekly Sabbath, it uses the same language as it used for atonement. It says, you shall not do any work. It doesn't say customary, ordinary, whatever. And so that's how I conclude, and I think we as a group conclude that that regulation applies to the weekly Sabbath. So here's where I'm going to inject some of my own logic here, or just common sense, if you will. Even though it says you should do no work, God doesn't mean you should lay in bed all day. I mean, he doesn't literally mean no work whatsoever. I guess it depends on your definition of work. And they were permitted to perform some task. And for example, they were expected to eat on a weekly Sabbath. So it was not a fast day, and they were expected to eat. And so, and to give an example of that, on Exodus 16, speaking of how to prepare manna, he, which is Moses, said to them, this is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside to be kept till morning. Which kind of lets you know they prepared manna in a number of different ways, like in a stew or porridge and baking like loaves probably, or pita or something. I'm not exactly sure, but anyway, that implies they were to eat the leftovers on the Sabbath. And that doesn't really apply. It says that's what you're to do. So that's where I get they were expected to eat on the Sabbath, but do most of the work on Friday. So one of the cooking, but it's not just cooking, but related regulations was in Exodus 35:3. It says, you shall kindle no fire throughout your dwellings on the Sabbath day. So specific, kindling a fire. Now today, strict Jews apply this very, very strictly. They will not do things such as even cut on a light switch because they believe creating a spark is violating this principle of kindling a fire. They won't run a car because it's internal combustion engine. They won't obviously turn on a gas stove. Some of them will leave the light on overnight, make sure it's turned on before Friday night so that they'll at least have some light. So they are applying that law in like the strictest way you could possibly have. Now, the Pharisees kind of came from that, so they probably believe that too. That doesn't necessarily mean that's how the ancient Israelites. I don't believe it evolved to that point at that time. Of course, they didn't have electricity and stuff, so it was different. But in my view, it makes more sense to look at the spirit of the law and how much effort was involved in kindling the fire. So recently I saw part of that movie Castaway, and Tom Hanks's character had a lot of work kindling the fire, and he eventually got it in the movie. But if you think about what it took, so I guess the point of this is you can take a phrase like "don't kindle a fire" and just kind of imagine that with the technology they had, what it would take to actually kindle a fire. And so I looked up some stuff, and this is from a BBC article talking about that, and some archaeological finds they found, and talking about kindling a fire. It goes, some researchers believe they have found the equipment ancient Israelites used to start a fire. They found some clay and stone cylinders, limestone slabs with small sockets in it, like a slab with a socket, have been found at other sites. And they believe these slabs were fireboards. And so what they would do is take a cylinder or like a small stick or something with a bow and use friction to start a fire. Doing it that way is kind of a lot of work. Another way they may have done it is some of them probably had flint and could, create a spark that way. And another way they could have done it is if there was a community fire, you could go get a coals or whatever from that fire and bring it back. To do that would involve getting your clay pot or whatever it is you're going to carry it in, going to there, getting some kind of a shovel thing and putting it in there and carrying it back. That actually was alluded to last week in the message in Genesis 23:6. Now, not on the Sabbath, but just doing that. So, and Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the two of them went together. So when it says he took the fire in his hand, he obviously put probably some coals, maybe a little bit of burning wood, but probably just some hot coals in something. You're not going to literally carry coals in your hand, but he was a pot small enough to carry. And I just thought that was a little bit interesting, but that was another way. But in any event, once you get a spark going, it's still a good bit of work to get a fire going. You got to tend it and stuff. So if you think about that amount of work, so compared to what it takes for us to start a fire with, let's say, a lighter. So I know this isn't a thus saith the Lord, and this is my opinion, but I think an appropriate way to look at this is to decide based on the amount of effort. Is it God worried about the fire or the amount of effort it took to get the fire? Is striking a match or turning a knob violating that principle? Most of Christians agree that it's not. I certainly don't. But we can glean from this the amount of work it took that he was talking about on kindling a fire. So, for example, if I were primitive camping somewhere, I wouldn't use the Sabbath to try my skill at creating a fire with friction. I do think that would be violating it, because it's like literally what he's talking about. If you're going to do that, start it with a match that day, and maybe another day use the, try out your primitive camping tricks. So talking about the meal itself. Now this is talking about meals on every day, but we would apply a lot of it to the Sabbath as well. So bread was, now this is from a Wikipedia article, and it says bread was eaten at just about every meal. And they made stews from lentils or beans were common, which we saw that in the Esau episode. And bread making began by milling the grain into flour, of course. It was a time-consuming task performed by women. And so each household stored its own grain. And it is estimated that it required 3 hours of work daily to produce bread for a family of 5. Now, I'm sure they got the kids involved in like a little production line or something. But that's a lot of work. So I already mentioned about the Esau, the stew. It did mention that Jacob gave Esau bread and stew. So it just kind of goes along with they pretty much had bread at every meal. Also, and this is just, I didn't find a source on this, but if they had meat, they don't have refrigeration. So you've got to actually butcher the animal and get it prepared. And I've never done it myself, but it doesn't take David Crockett to know that's a lot of work to do that, a pretty good bit. Also, cooking a pot of beans, raw beans, it's a lot of work. You have to tend it and stuff. So just imagine that amount of work. That's the kind of thing that was prohibited. So here's another example of meals from an article, ancienthebrew.org. And this is talking about meals that they routinely did, ancient Israelites. So they would wash their hands. Now, this is not the ceremonial washing that the Pharisees was talked about in the New Testament. This was because they ate with their hands and they had all kind of filth on them. So it would involve someone holding a water pitcher and holding it for you, and then they would do their hands. Usually they did not have a table. They had a mat, like a straw mat or something like that. And the people would sit on the ground, typically around it. And even the ones that did have a table was so low, they typically would still sit on the ground around it. Now you do see like Joseph in Egypt's palace. Yeah, they were rich enough. They had probably actual sitting up at a table like we would think about. But even then, I don't know. But they actually did have some sort of a table with more dishes and stuff than the average person's going to have. But this article here said the word shulchan, the Hebrew word for which usually translated table, has its root in the meaning of a skin or leather mat spread on the ground. And so they said typically there were no dishes except for the ones the food was contained in. So it was a community thing. And for soups, it says they would eat that by soaking it with bread instead of, or shaping the bread kind of like a spoon. So they would take turns dipping in there. And even in the Christ mentioned, who dips this in this hand in the dish. So they were still doing that a couple thousand years later, it looks like, at Christ's time of Christ. But so that just is some general idea of what a meal was like. So typically, so let's just think about it, how it would go on the Sabbath. So they would have prepared all this on Friday. I did find other articles saying what they would do is insulate it, cook the pot of stew on Friday. And there was a debate later, a long debate, by the way, which I'm not going to mention, about whether you should use straw as an insulating material. But regardless, they did have opportunity to insulate it so it wouldn't, meat, which they didn't have meat a lot, but stuff wouldn't spoil overnight, and it would be a little bit warm the next day. But so if it's time to eat on the Sabbath, it's not a zero amount of effort. You still have to go get the mat because they're not going to leave the mat on the ground for people to walk on. That'd defeat the purpose of it. It'd be as dirty as the ground. So, I couldn't find that as a source, but that's just using logic. So they would have to go get the mat wherever it was, put it down, especially if they ate outside, which I think they probably did when it wasn't raining. I don't know if they had room inside or not to eat. They're living in tents and that kind of, temporary kind of things, or not huge shelters anyway. if it was, they for sure couldn't afford the space of a mat and their living space. So they'd have to go get that, go wherever their pots were, put them on it, and get their water pot, their wineskin, and if they had bread, it was probably in a clay pot or a basket. Bring it over. If they had some of the other things, like they might have had, occasionally in season, some dried dates or something like that, go get that. Everybody sit down. They eat. They go through washing their hands, which involves picking up water. Now, I'm assuming they would have gotten the water on Friday, but still, they'd have to. It's still a little bit of effort in washing each other's hands, and then when they're done, pick up the mat and put it back. Now, if they didn't have dishes, that made cleaning those easy. There wasn't any, but anyway, that's just, to me, kind of look at that amount of effort, and I kind of compare that to what would be involved today. Like popping the TV dinner in the oven, to me, is no more effort than that. Preparing a big Thanksgiving meal, to me, is more effort. But, you got to kind of think about yourself. Now, so we see where that amount of effort was approved. We see the other side, the amount of effort that wasn't approved, baking bread for, milling flour and all that, the 30-hour process. So somewhere in the middle, there's where God thinks you're going too far. Where that is, don't know, and that's where we have to make a decision ourselves. But this gives you kind of a general idea of it. So I'll look at a couple other examples that were deemed to be okay on the Sabbath. And this one, very famous, everybody knows about it, but so Mark 3:23. So one Sabbath, speaking of Jesus and his guys, were going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain, presumably to eat them themselves right then. That's obvious what they were doing. The Pharisees, that violated their principles of work, but Christ did not think so. He thought that was okay. In our mind, it seemed like a pretty small amount of work, and we could see that really probably okay to do that. And then on Luke 13, then the Lord answered, this is Luke 13:15. Then the Lord answered him, "You hypocrites, does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead him away to water?" Now, this was in relation to him healing somebody. Now, I didn't use the example of it's okay to heal somebody because, as far as I know, none of us are able to do that. But the walking the donkey to water is a little bit of work, and it's an economic activity because that's usually what you had a donkey for. But it's also compassionate. You don't treat your animals; they don't know. They're probably glad not to be treading, carrying burdens or whatever that day. But that's just an example of the amount of work that was allowed, and some examples of work that's not allowed. So I've got one last verse I didn't cover some of the verses and about the amount of work. Most of the other ones are about conducting actual business on the Sabbath, like carrying loads in and selling stuff in the gates and stuff. So I've got Isaiah 53, verse 13. That's now this is a prophecy about the future, and it kind of gives you an idea of the importance God does put on keeping the Sabbath properly. So, I don't want to imply that we should be real lax about it, but like I say, it's got to be our own decisions there, applied from what we see in the Bible is trying to tell us. So this is the NRSV version, and starting in verse 13, it goes, "If you refrain from trampling the Sabbath, from pursuing your own interest on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the holy day of the Lord honorable, if you honor it, not going your own ways, serving your own interest, or pursuing your own affairs, then you shall take delight in the Lord, and I will make you ride upon the heights of the earth. I will feed you with the inheritance of your ancestor, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken.